Hello everyone, welcome to this video on word order in subordinate clauses in the early West Saxon dialect of Old English. Alright, so in Old English, word order in subordinate clauses follows different rules from that of main clauses. While main clauses allow for a more flexible word order, often governed by the verb-second word order, subordinate clauses frequently postpone the finite verb toward the conjugated verb, that is, toward the end of the clause, resembling the structure found in modern German rather than modern English. All right, so in modern English, we have verb second order in main clauses, and we can join multiple main clauses with verb second and then verbs pushed to the end. But in subordinate clauses, the verbs tend all of them to go to the end. This is like modern German. But in this video, I'll just briefly go over that again. And I've already covered this in previous videos, where to place the verbs in subordinate clauses. But I just want to have a look at how often this occurs, what percentage of subordinate clauses have verbs final. So we'll see that as we go. Because probably in past videos, I've given the impression that like it must be like modern German and it must be always at the end. And that's not the case because there are exceptions. So how often do verbs go to the end? That's ultimately what I want to get at in this video. But before we do, let's have a look at the structure of some subordinate clauses. So I might just for the moment hide that. All right, so a subordinate clause in Old English is introduced by subordinating conjunctions, that, there, for, thumb, there, etc. Okay. Relative pronouns, se, seo, that, there, or other subordinators. And the general word order in early West Saxon subordinate clauses is, and just notice I'm talking about early West Saxon, not late. In early West Saxon clauses is typically conjunction. That's one of these. Subject, object or objects, right, plus modifiers, plus infinitives, plus the finite verb. So the infinitive, that's the verb in its infinitive form if they're there. So a second verb and so on. The first verb goes to the very end. It's the finite or the conjugated verb. So this structure is often called verb-final order because the finite verb is often pushed toward the end. All right, so examples from historical texts. So let's look at a couple of examples from the early West Saxon text. So for instance, this one from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, again, early West Saxon. Und ek summe hi walden de renken there are mid him waren. And also some they wanted to drown who had formerly been with them. Now, the subordinator here is there, who. The subject is are mid him waren, had formerly been with them. And the verb placement, waren, the finite verb, the conjugated verb, appears at the end of the clause. You can see up here the end of the clause. All right. Here's the subordinating conjunction there. And then notice here, adverb here modifying before with him, before formerly with, them, were. All right, so an example from Alfred's Lives of Saints. Thonna se hund his modje sewikth there he are havde. Then the dog, his anger ceases, which he had before. Are is the adverb modifying the verb. But notice the verb is at the end here. Here's the subordinating conjunction, which. Subject he, object are havde, had before. Verb placement havde, finite verb at the end is at the end of the clause. All right, now let's have a look at some newly created examples in the early West Saxon subordinate clauses following the historical patterns. All right, so an example with a modal verb. So a modal verb is an auxiliary verb that expresses necessity or possibility. Modal verbs include must, shall, will, should, would, can, could, may, and might. It's what, that, he, that, we fluvian willa. I know that he wants to love the woman. Notice that subordinating conjunction here, and with, woman, to love, wishes, wants. All right, subordinator is that here. Subject he, object that with, the woman, and infinitive, luvian, to love. Okay, now finite verb placement, willa, wants, comes after the infinitive. Okay, so the infinitive and then the conjugated verb here. So from that clause here, this subordinate clause here, beginning with that, all right, notice the two verbs are at the end. All right, an example of a complex verb phrase. Say my that yawitan, sorry. Fair tha lar becaneowen haveth. The one may understand it who has learned the knowledge. There, who. Subordinated there, who. And then here's our subordinate clause after the comma. Subject say, the one. Object tha lar, the knowledge. Commas can mark the presence of a subordinate clause that follows. Verb placement. Becaneowen haveth, has learned. Verb final position. Example with a past tense auxiliary verb. He saparakon betham gumen. The he tha ringen havde crafted. I spoke about the man who had crafted the ring. So the subordinator there, who, up here, there. Subject he, object tha ringen, the rings. Verb placement, havde crafted, had crafted, verb final position. Right, the auxiliary being havde. All right, alternative word orders. So do we have to place the verbs always at the end in subordinate clauses? The answer is no. There is that tendency, and we'll attempt to quantify how great that tendency is later in this video, but it doesn't always have to be the case that verbs in subordinate clauses go to the end. All right? In German, modern German, all the verbs do in a subordinate clause go to the very end. In modern Swedish, the subordinate clause has the same order, word order, as the main clause. So you've got subject, verb, object typically in the main clause in Swedish, modern Swedish, and you've got the same in the subordinate clause for Swedish as well. So there's two different examples, two different ends of the spectrum. German with all the verbs at the end, and Swedish with subordinate clause word order, which is exactly the same as the main clause. Now, although Old English generally follows a verb-final structure in subordinate clauses, some variations occur, and it's this that I really want to get into in this video, because in past videos, I may have given the impression that verbs must always go to the end, and that is not true. They do not always have to go to the end. So a finite verb before infinitive, less common. Okay, remember how we had the finite verb or the conjugated verb at the very end, and then the infinitives before that? Well, you can have it the other way around. It's what that he willa luvian that weef. I know that he wants to love the woman. Here, willa appears before the infinitive luvian. All right, and notice you've got that weef, the noun, at the end here. Oh, so you've got the verbs in the mid place. Here, okay, I've done that. This word order is less common, but it's still possible in Old English. All right. Let's have a look at another one. Old English word order resembling modern English. So occasionally you might see an SVO, subject, verb, object order in spoken or poetic Old English. He sparak on beatham gumman. There he crafted havde tha ringen. I spoke about the man who had crafted the rings. Here, your crafted havde is split by the object, tha ringen. Remember, tha ringen. All right, so you've got subject, all right, verb, this pair here, and then you've got object, tharingen, in the accusative, tharingen. This is less common, but appears occasionally in poetic works. Okay, so how often in Old English do we have all the verbs at the end, and how often is that not the case? Okay, now maybe in earlier videos I've given you the impression that Old English tends to always have, not always, but tends to mostly have the verbs at the end. or pretty well always have the verbs at the end, sort of somewhere in that realm, and that's not quite true. Let me show you some evidence for that. All right, so in summary, standard word order in subordinate clauses: conjunction, subject, objects or object, infinitives, finite verb. Okay, so you may have one or more infinitives depending how many verbs you've got. Finite verb or the conjugated verb. So that he, that we've, Luvian Willa, that he wants to love the woman. You could have relative pronoun, there and others, plus subject, objects, modifiers, adverbs and so on. Verb final, the he, the ringen crafted havde, who had crafted the rings. All right, you can have less common variations now. A finite verb before infinitive, that he will luvian that with. So the finite verb here before the infinitive, that he wants to love the woman. Same interpretation before. SVO, resembling modern English. So there he crafted havde the ringen. So you've got subject, verb, this combination here, and then you've got object. Okay, nominative, conjugated verbs, and object, accusative. All right, so let's get down to quantifying how often do verbs and subordinate clauses go to the end. All right, so I went looking for some material and I found a PhD dissertation here by this individual. This is a position of verb in Old English relative clauses. It's just looking at relative clauses. It's not the only type of subordinate clause, as I pointed out before. An analysis of the Anglo-Saxon Gospels by Chris Haynes Martin can be found at this link, and hopefully I'll remember to put this link in the description below the video. Okay, if you have a look, verb placement initial in the subordinate clause, and you've got about 25% of cases doing that. Verb medial in the middle there, about 10% of cases. Verb final, about 57.5%, 57% of cases. Combination is sort of all over the place a bit, but you see in the relative clause, the verb only. So you've got comma or a subordinating conjunction, and then just a verb only. You know, the man who runs, right? The man who is always, or something, the man who runs, you know, who is a subordinating conjunction, runs is the verb, and it's there by itself in the subordinate clause. So that's about 5% there. So really that 5% there means you've got the verb at the end. So very simple. So you must take that 5% and add it here to this 57%. So you've got about 62.6% of subordinate clauses where the verb is at the end or verbs are at the end. All right? So it's over half, but you've still got about 38% where the verb is not at the end or verbs are not at the end. Okay, according to this study. Now, this dissertation, so he's written a PhD here, he's analysed these things, but this particular table I pulled out refers only to relative clauses, okay, and not to all subordinating clauses. Okay, let's go have a look now a bit further than that. Can we take this further? I found another site here, a research paper here, listed here, and in this paper, MC stands for main clause, SC for subordinating clause, AUX means the finite verb or the conjugated verb, and capital V means the non-finite verb, all right, infinitives and so on. All right, let's have a look. So in this one, they've grouped these first four are written in the early West Saxon dialect of Old English, and these are late West Saxon. So the first four early West Saxon, right? Bede has a little bit of late West Saxon in the translations and so on, but in this particular case, what's been looked at here has been the early West Saxon part. Right, so you've got, if you notice here, in the subordinating clauses here, that's a combined, the verbs are at the end. In Bede, you've got 67.4%. In Bertius, you have 48.2%. In the pastoralists, you have 36.5%. And in Chronicle A, the oldest known version of the Chronicle, well, at least that we have anyway, is 64.1%. So there's a real general pattern there. If you look in early West Saxon dialect of Old English, the verbs in the subordinate clauses definitely tend to go to the end, but not overwhelmingly. Like you're talking here on average, about 60% or so, if you were to average all of that, maybe about 60% of cases. So it's more than half. Although in the pastoralists here, it's only 36.5%. In late West Saxon, it drops a bit, as you can see here. So from early West Saxon and late West Saxon combined, it's about 46%. All right. Chronicle A is also known as the Winchester Chronicle or Parker Chronicle. It is the earliest surviving version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It is written in the early West Saxon, the dialect associated with King Alfred's court, and as are the three texts listed above it. So the top four here are early West Saxon dialect. You can see there's a tendency, quite a strong tendency, for the verbs to go to the end of the subordinate clause, but not always. Modern German always has, almost without exception, except perhaps in poetic cases, perhaps, I don't know, almost without exception, you have the verbs at the end of the subordinate clause, but not in Old English, in the early West Saxon dialect of Old English. And then another example you have with Swedish, the subordinating clause, the minor clause, relative clause, what have you, has the same word order as the main clause, subject, verb, object. All right. So anyway, just to give you some sense of it, because I'm concerned that in past videos, looking back over them, I've given the impression somehow it must be like modern German and you must always put the verbs to the end. That's not always the case. As you can see here, we've attempted to quantify it here. And that's just two papers, one PhD dissertation and another research paper, which did a count and looked. And you can see in these subordinate clauses that together, this one is infinitive and finite verb order, and this one is finite verb and infinitive. So both of those are verbs, but combining those, you can see in Bede it's 67.4%, Bertius 48.2%, the Cura Pastoralis 36.5%, and Chronicle A 64.1%. And definitely tends to looks higher than, say, in late West Saxon. So there's a change happening there. Interesting though, isn't it? And I think let's have a look. All right. So the early West Saxon dialect of Old English generally places a finite verb at the end of subordinate clauses, as I was saying in previous videos. But this video, I've been able to quantify that a bit and show that it's quite often not the case. You're roughly looking about, on average, about 60% of the time the verbs will go to the end. Similar to modern German, however, some flexibility exists and occasional variations occur, especially in poetry and spoken language. So don't always feel you have to put the verbs, conjugated or otherwise, at the end of your subordinate clauses. It doesn't have to be that way. Other possibilities are okay too. They're fine, both in poetry and in spoken language. All right. And probably more than occasional, like maybe about 40% of the case, the verbs are not all going to the end. So don't feel absolutely restricted that you have to put them all at the end when you're trying to make up your own texts or speak the language. All right, so I think reappear that again. All right, I hope that video is useful to people. If you do find it useful, please push the like button and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate that. I'll see you in future videos. Take care, everyone. I hope you like my AI generated image of an early Anglo-Saxon village. I think I asked the ChatGPT to give me 5th century village, so I don't really know how accurate it is. I'm hoping it is. I'm sort of trusting to ChatGPT. It has got better over time, and I think it's still got room to improve, or can do, but I'm particularly a bit fond of this image at the moment. Anyway, thank you for watching. I shall see you in the next video. Take care, and look after yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you again. All right, bye for now.